Welcome back, everyone, to today's Explainer. Let's just jump right into it, because today we are taking an incredibly intricate, deep dive look into the magic system of the Dreamweaver universe. And I gotta say, if you are someone who appreciates fantasy world building that goes way beyond just, throwing random fireballs at bad guys, you are in for an absolute treat today. Seriously, this is pretty much a masterclass in how to construct a magical ecosystem that actually feels as rigorous, as structured as real-world physics and psychology. It's just brilliant. So over the course of this explainer, we are going to break down exactly how universal laws govern magical forces, how those forces are then harnessed by individuals, and finally, and this is the best part, how all of this high-level theory actually translates into high-stakes, real-time tactical battlefield applications. It's this massive, fascinating journey from the deeply philosophical all the way to the highly practical. So here is our game plan for today. We're going to hit the philosophy of balance, run through the predominant elements, look at the evolution of sigils, check out the sigil classes, compare cursed weapons to protectors, and then wrap it all up with an awesome tactical case study.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the philosophy of balance and the seal of Endring.
Okay, so to unlock these incredibly powerful ancient limiters, specifically things like the seal of Endrigen, users really have to grasp this foundational philosophy first. To truly understand the sheer weight of this, we need to look at a pretty pivotal moment of training from the source text. We get this quote from the character Gramps, and he basically establishes the core physical and spiritual stakes of this entire system. He says, and I quote, "That requirement is balance, which can only be achieved by one with a deep understanding of their identity and a strong will." Now let's unpack that, because it's not just philosophical fluff. When a Dream Knight actually manages to unlock the Seal of Endrigen, which is also known as the Seal of Awakening, they undergo a radical and honestly super dangerous transformation. I want you to literally imagine this. You are suddenly wearing armor made out of flowing liquid water, but at the exact same time your cape is this torrential, raging stream of pure fire. Your insignia is blindingly bright golden light, and your face is completely obscured by a mask of deep, impenetrable shadow. The source text actually describes it as a dream being version of Jekyll and Hyde. It's crazy. But here is the catch. Without absolute internal balance, and I mean a will of literal iron, those wildly conflicting powers would instantly destroy the user. Think about it. The fire cape would immediately boil and evaporate the water armor, or the water would just completely quench the fire. So the very act of just surviving that transformation, that alone is absolute proof of the wielder's perfect internal equilibrium.
Moving right along, let's dive into Section 2, the 7 predominant elements and the Seal of Comnid. So, once a magic user actually comprehends that intense balance we just talked about, they can then release the basic elemental seal. And doing this unlocks the 7 predominant elements of their homeworld. But as you might expect from a system this structured, it strictly divides these elements into 2 major, totally opposing categories. On one side, we have what are called the elements of generation. This includes water, wind, earth, and light. Basically, these are your nurturing forces. They're the elements that build things up, heal, and sustain life. Then, naturally, on the opposing side, we have the elements of destruction, fire and lightning. These are your chaotic, wild, consuming forces. Now, you might be counting along and thinking, wait a second, that was only 6 elements, and you'd be right. That is because the 7th element is entirely unique and operates by its own completely distinct set of rules. That 7th element, sitting perfectly right in the middle of this massive divide, is time. Time is strictly classified as a neutral element. It is the literal embodiment of the ultimate balance between good and evil, between generation and destruction. Gramps gives this phenomenal explanation for it. He points out that if you really sit down and study history, what do you see? You see these long periods of immense, incredible progress, which is generation, but they are always inevitably followed by periods of catastrophic ruin, which is destruction. It's a cycle. Therefore, the Dream Knights who actually have an affinity for time, they are universally recognized as the absolute wisest of all the element users. Why? Because they possess this incredibly deep intrinsic comprehension of history. They don't just see the now, they inherently understand the long chain of cause and effect. They see the positive, they see the negative, and they can actually utilize this profound overarching knowledge to swing things in either direction. It's a tremendous amount of power based purely on wisdom.
But you know what I love most about the universe of Dreamweaver? It absolutely does not leave these elements as just vague, abstract, magical concepts. The source material goes out of its way to beautifully ground these ideas in actual, real-world physics. It shows us how even antithetical, completely rival elements actually share common foundational traits. Let's look at fire and water again.
Fire burns things up, water cools things down, right? Simple. But look at the actual physics behind that. Heated atoms move much faster, while cooled atoms move much slower. Therefore, in this system, both fire and water share a joint influence over the very concept of motion, and by extension, the perception of time itself. You literally cannot have rapid motion without the heat of fire, but you absolutely need the coolness of water to prevent things from hitting absolute extreme chaos. They do the exact same thing with earth and wind. Earth exerts weight through the forces of gravity and magnetism. Wind, on the other hand, diminishes weight through the principles of flotation and aerodynamics. They are complete opposites in how they act, yet they both share joint dominion over the singular concept of weight. Seriously, for anyone who loves deep fantasy writing, this right here is exactly how you build a magic system that feels completely scientifically real.
All right, let's shift gears to Section 3, the evolution of sigils and how people manifest their identity.
So, in this world, a sigil isn't just handed to you. It actually has to be earned psychologically. Let's walk through Fenrir's 6-step evolution to see exactly how a sigil is born, because it is a fascinating psychological journey. First, step 1. It starts as just a simple lingering impression, maybe a stray thought or a feeling. Over time, as you focus on it, it deepens into step 2, a conscious goal. You start putting deliberate, consistent effort into that goal, and it blossoms into step 3, a dream. But here's where it gets tough. As you step out into the world, you have to fight for that dream. You have to defend it against detractors and hardships. And in that crucible, that dream hardens into step 4, a conviction. Finally, when that conviction becomes so ingrained in you that it is the very embodiment of who you are, when you truly, completely understand it, it becomes step 5, an ideal. It is only at this exact, precise moment, when an abstract concept has been fully realized into a practical, undeniable part of a person's identity, that step 6 happens. A sigil manifests. So a sigil is literally, physically, the manifestation of a person's most deeply held identity. It's who they are, brought into the real world.
Which brings us nicely to Section 4, the 7 sigil classes, and scaling power by bonds.
Okay, so not all sigils are operating on the same power level. Arlene breaks down this incredibly detailed power taxonomy that scales all the way from just a single person's unique identity up to a universal sigil that is shared across an entire reality. At the very base level, you have the individual class. This is completely unique to the single user. Then, as bonds form, you move up through family bloodlines. Widen the circle, you get tribal heritage. Widen it again, you hit organizational common goals and then national citizenship. Scaling up even further, we reach the world class, which is born from major international treaties binding whole nations together. And finally, at the absolute very peak of this pyramid, you have the universal class, which is utilized by anyone and everyone who shares a common reality. The math here is simple, but the implication is incredibly profound. The more people who are actively involved in maintaining a shared ideal, the exponentially stronger that sigil becomes. It's basically a magical network effect.
Now for Section 5, where things get a bit darker. Cursed weapons versus protectors.
Because sigils are the literal manifestations of identity, they are incredibly vulnerable to the moral intent of the person wielding them. A sigil naturally contains a fraction of its wielder's guardian force. You can kind of think of this like a guardian angel. When a dream knight reaches a truly deep level of self-comprehension, their psyche naturally fuses with this force. This is a beautiful state of willing, mutual cooperation, and it's called an awakening. But we have to contrast the pure willing synergy of that awakening against something much darker. A possession. A possession happens when evil beings, like the villain Zamfar, for example, violently force their own twisted will upon a human being. They completely subjugate the host's free will just to accomplish their own malicious schemes. So you're looking at the stark difference between a willing partnership built on trust and a violent hijacking of someone's soul.
And this leads us to a really grim warning from Arlene. She explains that a sigil grows alongside its wielder, very much like nurturing a child. It starts out in this dormant state, eventually moves to an active state, and, if nurtured right, can ultimately become a fully autonomous living sigil that fights alongside you and protects you like a true battle partner. But this prompts a genuinely terrifying rhetorical question. What actually happens if that growth process is fed entirely by malice? What if the predominant emotions that are constantly poured into that developing child are dark, twisted, and just completely negative?
Well, the resulting nightmare is what's known as a cursed weapon. When a craftsman, or even a dream knight themselves, focuses incredibly strong negativity, hatred, or ill intent into their sigil's development, the sigil becomes totally corrupted. Instead of getting a protective, loyal living sigil, it violently transforms into an adversary. It essentially gives you massive, continuous debuffs that actively drain and damage you from the inside out. Imagine that. Your very own identity, which you manifested into physical form, turns right around and attacks you. You literally become your own worst enemy. It is a brutal consequence of letting negativity rule your mind.
All right, let's wrap this up with Section 6, Tactical Magic. This is our infiltration case study.
To prove that all of this dense philosophical magical theory actually matters in real combat, we are going to look at Kieran's infiltration of an enemy fortress. And I love this part because it brilliantly illustrates the philosophy behind the Sagittarius cryptography system. The source text asks this really profound, almost Zen-like question about ancient communication. What is a messenger, an individual, or the embodiment of the message? Think about it. When you attach a written message to an arrow and you fire that arrow across a battlefield, yes, technically the arrow is carrying the message, but practically speaking, to the person receiving it, the arrow becomes the message. This conceptual framing maps perfectly onto the Sagittarius skill, which is this unique fusion of deep human wisdom and raw beastly instinct. It allows a Dream Knight to infiltrate an enemy camp not by physically sneaking over a brick wall in the dead of night, but by fusing psyches with an ally who is already on the inside. You get to experience everything from a literal first-person perspective, acting as the message yourself.
So Kieran completely bypasses the need for sheer physical force through an unbelievable display of tactical magic. First, he fuses psyches with the captive villagers inside the fortress using that awakening state we talked about earlier. Remember, this means he absolutely requires their willing, voluntary loyalty to enter their minds. He can't just force his way in. Second, he integrates his magic into the Taurus system, transforming it into this hyper-advanced stat monitoring network. He is literally reading the captive's physical and mental stats in real time. If their fatigue metric spikes on his end, he knows they're doing forced labor. If their fear metric spikes, he knows they're being psychologically tortured. And finally, once he has the intel, he exploits an absolutely ingenious immunity loophole involving Phoenix Tears and, honestly, wait for it, lemonade. Yes, lemonade.
But before we get to the lemonade strategy, let's quickly look at what Kieran is actually up against here, because the odds are completely stacked against him. The enemy fortress is run by an immortal basilisk, and this guy's forces rely completely on inflicting debilitating status effects. He commands wraiths, which are these malevolent spirits that literally suck the positive emotions right out of you to fuel their nightmares, and Jumenorcan, which are these terrifying flame-engulfed creatures that are physically born from those corrupted dreams. So this isn't a straightforward battle for a decisive, clashing victory. Kieran is locked in a highly calculated war of psychological attrition that is specifically designed by the enemy to just bleed the heroes dry over time.
So how do they win? Kieran and his team strike back with brilliant, subtle logistics. It turns out, because their captive villagers' ancestors historically consumed Phoenix Tears, these villagers have a latent genetic immunity to those debilitating status effects, provided the status is cured at least once. To supercharge this natural immunity, Kieran's team secretly brews tens of thousands of units of lemonade, laced with highly concentrated, undilutable Phoenix Tears. They manage to covertly distribute this to the captives over a slow 13-day countdown. Day by day, the concentration of the Phoenix Tears in the captives' bloodstreams steadily increases. And here is the absolute kicker. The Weaver of Calamity's dark forces are violently allergic to Phoenix Tears. So, by the time the countdown ends, the enemy guards literally cannot even approach their own prisoners without suffering severe, debilitating allergic reactions. The heroes don't even have to draw their swords. They render the enemy army physically incapable of coming near the captives simply by manipulating the captives' diet from afar. It is an absolute, stunning, non-violent tactical masterstroke.
And that brings us to the end. I want to leave you with this final, lingering thought derived straight from Fenrir's warning in the source text. What happens if a Dream Knight completely masters the technical, mechanical application of a sigil, but deep down they lack true confidence in their own ideal? Fenrir explicitly explains that while the physical precision might be completely flawless, the magic itself will carry absolutely zero actual force. The energy just diffuses, and the user hits an insurmountable wall. In this universe, perfectly applied magic is utterly, completely useless if the wielder lacks a true, unwavering belief in their own identity. So I ask you, in a world governed by rules like these, what do you think matters more? Flawless technical application or the raw, undeniable power of unwavering personal conviction? Think about that for a bit. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I will see you in the next explainer.